I don't have, thanks, Danielle. So I want to welcome everyone and just ask you to please mute yourself. And Danielle, if folks don't do that, if you could mute them, please, just until the question and response time, that would be great. And we do welcome you here. This is pretty exciting. We have Dr. Jerome Lubbe, like liberate. It's not lube, and as he will tell you later, but we have the whole brain doctor in the house, and really grateful for the work that Dr. Lubbe has been doing, Dr. Jerome, that he is giving us a way to see ourselves as more than an Enneagram style. If you've been with us on other Midday Cafes, you know that when we were writing our book, Spiritual Rhythms for the Enneagram, we told InterVarsity Press we wanted the name to be More Than Your Type. And they said, no, it sounded like a dating book. So they didn't let us use that title. But I gravitate toward people like Dr. Jerome, who are not giving us a style or a type, but are saying you are more than, you are whole brained, you have more access than you could ever imagine. And then bringing in as a functional neurologist. Wow, isn't that great? Like, neurology is great, but let's have it be functional. Yeah. And helping us understand neuroplasticity that tells us that we're capable of change. And so that's just good news right here, everyone, because does anybody want to just say, I hope my husband changes, I hope my friend changes, or no, I hope I change. Yeah. And so there's so many great things to say about Dr. Jerome. You can look him up on drjerome.com or the patient doctor, because he was a patient before he was a doctor, and maybe he'll tell us a bit about that. But we just want to say welcome before we take a moment to just center ourselves. So welcome, Dr. Jerome. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me. Such a gift.
So let's take a moment, everyone, and maybe get your feet flat on the ground and give yourself some space here. You may want to soften your gaze and look down, or close your eyes. Hold your hands in a way that is either open and welcoming, or maybe you want to fold your hands to keep your energy inside for the moment, because you're always bringing your energy outside. So however you can be here now. And take a breath. However you breathe, that helps you remember yourself. Just notice how much of you is here in the room and how much is left in that last conversation or that last newscast. And see if you can't bring more of yourself right here, right now. And even as I said the word newscast, many of you may have been triggered by the last image. And so I'm going to invite you to do something the heart math people encourage us to do. And that is bring to your own consciousness a person that has helped you feel safe or loved or celebrated. A person or a place that has helped you feel safe or loved or celebrated. And bring them fully into your consciousness here. Let that place or person come fully into your consciousness. Someone who helped you feel safe or loved or celebrated. And then breathe them right in and around your heart space. It may sound strange to some of you, but you're helping your heart center to awaken and welcome. So just breathe either that place or that person right down into your heart center for 11 seconds. And then as you're able, just begin to slowly come to the screen and know that in this little bit of time that we have together, we're welcoming someone who is safe and loving and celebrates your identity. And the brain-based Enneagram is really built around welcoming all three centers of intelligence, around celebrating your identity and the becoming yourself as a whole-brained person. And so, I was telling Dr. Jerome that my heart is in Haiti. We just had our friend from Haiti here this weekend who we've been working with schools in Haiti for almost 30 years. And I know that right now I need to be regulated. My limbic system is has made a limbic attachment to what's happening in Haiti, to the memories of the 2010 earthquake. And I need ways to remember that I am more than just my memories, but that I have access and that I really can rewire my brain, that I'm capable of change. And so we're in the presence of someone who's devoting his life to this kind of work on our behalf and on his own behalf, as first being a patient before being a doctor. And so can you tell us a little bit about that, a little snapshot, Dr. Jerome, about the needs in your own life to become whole-brained?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And thank you so much, Claire, and also Danielle for this space. It's great to see everybody it's a Wednesday, right? It's Wednesday, Wednesday lunchtime, your space, and definitely throw questions, and I'll defer to Danielle and Claire to drive which questions to answer, so I don't check the chat while I'm chatting with you. But yeah, it's such a gift to be with everybody. I don't look the part, but my story actually starts as an African immigrant kid who moved to the States on asylum status in the early 90s. I don't look like a Jerome. Most of my counterparts that are Jerome don't have the same melanin component that I have. But fast forward, as an immigrant kid, I have an identical twin brother who has never had any migraines and never had any complex headaches. And I started having migraines when I was 17 as a senior in high school, a few years after my dad passed when I was a freshman. And over the last 21 years, I've averaged 8 to 12 full-blown migraines per calendar month for the last 21 years, which is intense. And also, I'm going to share, I'm very efficient in two. So the chances of me getting through this without having some degree of emotionality are non-existent. Okay, so thank you in advance for that space. But it's been a conversation of working through. I went to 21 specialists over 9 years. I spent $100,000 in the first 6 years of my marriage. Got married young, trying to get a diagnosis that once we had the diagnosis, no one knew what to do with it. I was run over by a car when I was 8 because my twin brother is a terrible spotter. And when you're a poor immigrant kid, you share one bike, and you need your twin brother, who's very high in 7, not to get distracted when you pull out in front of a car. He's supposed to tell you there's a car coming. So my first introduction to the potential damage that distraction can do was with my identical twin brother. I also grew up with a very, very strong 8 energy father who was a special forces person in the Rhodesian Bush War. He was a Selous scout who spoke 13 languages, did a job that had an average life expectancy of 6 months. He did it for over a decade. And I say that in my encounter with 8 energy because I'm the only person that I know that was run over by a car and then subsequently spanked by my dad for being run over by that car. So if anybody's like, wow, I grew up with an intense dad, yeah, I can certainly relate to that. So lots of different pieces in my background, but realistically, what ended up coming into the patient journey was I had that closed head injury or acquired brain injury when I was 8. Had a couple of concussions in high school, and then was hit by a drunk driver on 2 separate occasions before I was 21. So by the time I got to 21, my body had been through some things. My undergrad is in digital animation and film. I used to do music full time, so I don't look the part of the standard provider with the beard and the gauges, because I got those when I was 17 before they were cool, back in 1999, which I'm sure some of you were close to 17 in 1999 as well, right? But for me, that was half a lifetime ago, because I'm 38 at this point. But yeah, it just turned out that I think my experience, both as an immigrant, as a person growing up in very charismatic Pentecostal churches and now being a recovering charismatic, being somebody who grew up in clinical spaces and Enneagram spaces, all of my places that I've grown up in, either as an immigrant, a patient, a spiritual body, or also in the clinical and Enneagram worlds, I always ended up in places where I had questions that weren't really either appropriate or couldn't really be answered effectively in a way that made sense. And that's where a lot of the work that I do comes from. I became a doctor because I was a patient who couldn't find a good one. I became an Enneagram person because of the introduction to it, but started working in the neuroscience behind it, because you Google the brain-based Enneagram, or you Google the neuroscience and the neuropsychology behind the Enneagram, and there's not much on it. Became a more evolved person in my faith because the container that I was in felt like it was moving me away from my relationship with the divine, and I wanted to be closer and not further. And the containers felt like they were restrictive, not because I wanted to abdicate or move away, but I actually wanted to connect in a more deep way. So in all of the spaces that I navigate, I think it's just a connection of trying to understand my world a little bit better when resources were short, which is why it's entertaining, and we'll talk about it today, that most people think that I'm actually most efficient in 5. I'm actually least efficient in 5, and knowing that has been one of the most powerful things for making sure that I take care of myself well as somebody who leads in 2. But knowing the entire stack of my orientation for types is actually not something that we're taught a lot, or at all. And that can be some of the space that we navigate today, but that's how I ended up where I'm at. A bit of a disparate experience for a white African immigrant kid named Jerome, who became a doctor, but originally intended to make movies with special effects. So it's been a bit of a convoluted journey. So
and it's wonderful because we're hearing your heart. We're hearing your instinctual center, and we're hearing your intellect, and it's wonderful.
Thank you.
I think one of the things that is probably most fascinating to me, reading your book and taking your little mini course, is the brain-based Enneagram. So imposing the Enneagram over the top of the brain.
Yeah.
Do you have a way that you can explain that to this group?
I do. And if Danielle or you could allow me to share my screen, I'll show you a couple of pictures, because I know some folks are kinesthetic and some folks are visual and some folks are academic in terms of just data. So I'll show you a couple of things. But just generally speaking, Claire, what ended up happening for me was I was coinciding my introduction to the Enneagram at the same time I was doing some postgraduate work in neurochemistry, neuroscience, and functional neuroanatomy. So basically how the brain works, right? And when I got introduced to the Enneagram, I didn't actually get introduced through a visual component. It was an audio recording. I actually got introduced to Richard Rohr and the Enneagram at the exact same moment, because somebody sent me a recording that was about 10 hours long of Father Richard doing a breakdown of the general introduction to Enneagram 101. And as I'm listening to it, I go, God, this sounds a lot like basic brain function. Like, this sounds like a human being, right? But I didn't have any lineage in the Enneagram or predisposition to a bias of how to engage the Enneagram. So my default as a functional neurologist and as a chiropractor and as somebody who has 3 board certifications and 7 board eligibilities is my brain and my experience comes from a holistic perspective, the whole person, right? So when I was listening to it, I go, well, I didn't assume to compartmentalize anything. My ignorance was bliss in that space, that I didn't understand typing. I understood all of the pieces. And one of the first things that came up was when he was describing the head, heart, and the gut, I didn't have the visual. And again, this was the benefit of the time. So when I think head and I think heart and I think gut, I'm in a space where the orientation is the head is above the heart and the heart is above the gut. So I learn all of these things, and then I go and look at my first image reading The Wisdom of the Enneagram by Riso and Hudson. And I'm just going to admit somebody, guys, because it shows that I think because I'm the host, I should probably admit somebody. There we go. Welcome. There we go. Default privileges that you didn't know or you weren't going to have. So I'm just going to, it's okay, right? It's okay. Everything is there. Yeah, everything is therapy.
Like the name of your next book, Default Privileges of the Brain.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's great. You and I could definitely talk, Daniel. There's a lot there. Yeah. So the person who just popped up the comment about Vegas, a lot of it just automatically connected with how the brain works. But the interesting thing is, the very first time I saw the image, literally, I'll never forget. I was sitting at a dinner table in Smyrna, Georgia, about 11 years ago, and I'm looking at this image, and I go, "Why is this upside down?" Like, nobody's gut is above their head. Does anybody know who, if I'm standing on my head, my gut is above my head. So I didn't have this understanding of the way that Enneagram is oriented with the 9 at the top. So I flipped it upside down and I said, if I think about this from brain function, the head orients with generalized left brain function, the heart generalized with right brain function, and then the gut is very brainstem and all of the subconscious mechanisms that help us to operate. So I spent the last 11 years trying to go that initial concept of, if I'm a whole person using my whole brain, moving away from this old science of hemispheres and left to right brain dominance, and I use my whole system as a human being, how would that overlay with the entire Enneagram, right? And if that's true, if the way that we're built is actually the way that we operate, and the way that we show up in the world with the Enneagram is actually evidence of the way that our systems functionally operate, can that provide opportunities to create resources and connections for people to exercise their type or their center just like you would a muscle? Because in the world of functional neurology, for the way that I work, I'm taking in almost exclusively complex unresolved cases. So if I have an 11-year-old that's nonverbal, or a 72-year-old who's in a wheelchair and wants to walk again, or a 45-year-old who's got a movement disorder, they've already seen everybody that's done really, really good work of looking at them as a system or a diagnosis, but nobody's looking at them as a whole person. And generally speaking, you have a constellation of things going on. So one of the phrases that I use is, if anybody hasn't told you this, right, in the world that we're living in the moment, as an example, you're allowed to have more than one problem. You're also allowed to have more than one solution. And I think the way that that happens is understanding that we're more than just a number or a center. So for example, let me show you a couple of pictures, and I appreciate everybody's patience for letting me kind of share that. So here's an example, okay? So everybody's got the basics of the Enneagram mandala, right? But what I did was turned it vertically and then rotated it horizontally, okay? So this side of the brain correlates with your left hemisphere, and 5, 6, and 7 overlay that intelligence center. But we know that the left brain, the right brain, and the whole central nervous system is obviously very heavily connected, right? But the real estate has its own responsibility, kind of like when you're working in a company, some people have roles and responsibilities, but they're all a part of the organization, right? This is just an organization.
And Dr. Jerome, before you get into the organization, I'm going to ask everyone to please mute themselves. We're getting someone's background noise. If you could please, everybody, make sure you're muted. And I see a few of you still are unmuted. And so Danielle Fanfare, I don't know if you can help us with muting folks. Sure. That'd be great. Thank you very much.
Yes, keep an eye on the chat. I'm pinging the folks who are accidentally unmuted, just to let you know that maybe a button may have gotten tapped inadvertently. So keep it on the chat.
Awesome.
Yeah, we're okay. And what I can do also, Danielle, just as a heads up, is I can make you a co-host. And if you're a host or a co-host, you can actually click on the participants and you can manually mute them. Actually, it's not letting me make you a co-host, but if anybody accidentally unmutes, I can do it. We can multitask. It's okay. It's also it's okay. It's also we have sorry, let me make sure I'm sharing the right image here. We have a saying in the clinic. It's actually printed on shirts and t-shirts that everything is therapy. If you let it be, right? If you let it be, so we can have that opportunity to use us as therapy as well. So let me go back, and thank you for catching that, Danielle. I appreciate it. So this image And credit where credit is due. My undergrad being in digital animation and graphic design, I always have a heart for aesthetics, right? It's like food, you eat with your eyes first. But this artwork is my concept, but my art director's execution. So it's another example of collaborative spaces. I can't do this, but she can, and I communicate the idea, she executes it. So everything that you see visually across the board in my work is done by an incredible human named Amy Strickland, who is very, very, very high in self-preservation 5. So she's always happy for me to say that when she's not in the room. So it's great. But coming back to this, you're just seeing 5, 6, and 7 of the basic intelligence center of thinking and head correlated with the left hemisphere. The 4, 3, and 2 is correlated with the heart and the right hemisphere. And then the 1, 9, and 8 is correlated not only with the cerebellum and the brainstem, but essentially just a placeholder for non-cortical spaces, subcortical spaces. So you got your big brain, and then you got the brain stem, and you got all those subconscious things, right? So another way of looking at it, to show you another picture, is when we're looking at whole identity. You know, I use this as an analogy based on my lived experience, right? If I tell you that I'm South African born to Zimbabwean parents, and I immigrated on asylum status from Congo when it was Zaire before it became the DRC, and I landed in Northeast Tennessee, went to 11 different schools before I graduated high school. I've had 26 addresses, 9 of them in the 16 years that I've been married, and I now currently reside in Atlanta, but I did my undergrad in Phoenix, and my twin brother lives in Houston, who's half of who I am at the inception point. Where do you tell me that I'm from? Right? Like, how do I answer that question? It's not that simple. I can tell you where I am currently, but if I go to visit my twin brother in Houston, where am I at? So shout out to Danielle. I hear you on that. Totally. My twin brother is in Houston, and we have a multitude of conversations about loving our fellow Texans. My first son was born in Dallas. So I have a Texan in my family. My twin brother has a Texan in his. I've got 3 kids. He's got 4. So I get all of that, but I can't tell you where I'm from. I can guarantee you one thing: I'm from Earth. I know that much. Okay. So I'm from this planetary experience called Earth, but I've been multi-continental, right? My mom is British. I have a UK passport, a Zimbabwean passport, a South African passport, and a US passport. So I have passports to 3 continents. Okay. And 4 total passports, because I'm a citizen in 3 countries and a legal resident alien in the US. So I use that to paint the picture. I'm a global container of what it means to be a human being. If we look at the Enneagram the same way, we've leaned into these things in a lot of way from, for instance, how many people know their instinctual stack, right? You know what you have: a lead, a support, and a blind. We know that we engage in different ways with the instinctual stack. How many people know your stack for your intelligence center? You're like, I have a lead intelligence center, I have a support, and a blind. I know that based on my stances. I know based on what I lead. But then we've got this bookend of intelligence centers and instincts, but in the middle with types, we're like, I am A. So we took the concept of being able to utilize multiple things in the intelligence centers and the instincts, but then we removed that from the types. So part of the work is to show that we also have fluencies and proficiencies if we consider all of the types to be a part of who we are. You also have that. You just may have different degrees of activation. So I'm going to take a deep breath, load another image, and show you 2 different perspectives, and then we'll keep jumping into dialogue. How's my speed? Am I doing okay, everybody? I tend to talk a little fast. I want to make sure, but it's also being recorded. And I tell everybody, if it's interesting and applicable enough, you can go back and watch it, and you can hit pause. So I've kind of stopped apologizing for going so fast because I want to give you as much as I can in the hour. Yes, ma'am.
Colette asked, by whole brain, do you mean integrated brain and nervous system?
Yes, ma'am. So not only whole brain from a real estate standpoint, structurally, but there's 2 keywords that you can look up that are really, really leaning into the nature of the way we're understanding how brains work nowadays. One of them is called the default mode network, and the other one is called a connectome, right? So I want you to think about, we're all, is there anybody internationally, or is everybody US, right? Okay. Everybody's, I think, US, right? Or even if we consider what's happening in different states at the moment. Think of like whole brain, even if we just look at the US, the amount of impact that it would take in one city to change traffic in the entire country would be significant. But how many of you have been in your own cities and you're like, why in the world is this drive taking 45 minutes compared to 10? If you're in Atlanta, that's a daily experience for us, okay? Because there's always congestion. But I'm pointing to the fact that when you look at the whole brain as a traffic system, you can have one area completely unrelated geographically impact another area because it's about flow, it's about congestion, it's about traffic. An example of where this is an extreme is, does everybody remember what happened to air traffic within about 4 hours of 9/11? Right? You had a significant enough event in one city that affected traffic globally, right? Because the event was so significant. That's a catastrophic event. That, for me, in my world, is a head injury. I can very quickly and very easily neuter the idea that people do not change types if you connect with people who have head injury. You quintessentially will affect type and affect intelligence center when you have a head injury. So it's not whether or not you can change type, it's what causes that change. And oftentimes it takes something significant, life-changing, catastrophic, or profoundly life-giving, right? If you've had somebody who's never experienced what it feels to be connected, seen, and loved, and the first time in their life they ever feel seen, connected, and loved, you are going to restructure the actual hardware of their brain, okay? It's that real. So 9/11 changed the traffic of the entire country and expanding countries. But a lot of the times it's the subtlety of how we're impacting things within the same region. So a way to look at that from a visual standpoint is to show you this picture. So this is what we refer to as Pangea, all right? Everybody knows that all the continents that are on the planet, they used to be connected, okay, according to most contemporary science. If you're a flat earth person, I can't help you with this, but everybody else, this is generally speaking the truth, okay? Sorry, that's levity on my part, just to offer that for a second. But if you look at this, we're still seeing the same orientation of what the types are. So the numbers that are on the outside are what you know as the types. The words that are on the outside of this are my personal lexicon for the gifts of those numbers. So if you see the word associated with that number, that for me is the natural capacity, the natural gift that is intrinsically wired with that particular type, right? So for instance, me being very efficient in 2, 6, and 3, those are my top 3. I can very quickly bring in a significant amount of unconditional love, but it's also healthy for me to exercise restraint and sometimes set conditions so I don't run out of fuel because I love everybody. And that is not actually going to be beneficial long-term. There's a law of diminishing returns. Confidence, obviously, if you go to 11 different schools and you have an identical twin brother who is 85 pounds lighter than you when you graduate as a senior in high school, and it creates a few body image issues, you learn to develop a feigned sense of confidence until you have a real sense of confidence, which is also part of my journey. So just a couple of those words there that you see on the outside. But then when you see here, what we're showing is that you've got the heart, head, and gut that everybody knows about. I use the words instinct, intellect, and intuition. But these words that are associated with this, okay, are different ways of saying, okay, how do we connect globally with each of these intelligence centers as it relates not only to our type geographically, but to the world global experience. And I appreciate what all of you are doing right now, which is a classic example of what happens when you put up a really complicated picture, is everybody goes like this. And they start reading it, right? It's why I don't tend to teach with slides. I'll show you the picture and I'll share this with you guys. I don't mind. And there are also a lot of them are up on my website because it's just, you're like, my brain automatically goes, I want to be healthier and better. And I want to process all the things that we're processing. I don't want to miss the thing that helps me to feel whole and better. I've got to really soak it all in. It's being recorded. Don't worry. You can go back. You can hit pause. It's right there. It's okay. But my point in that is when you look at that, we're trying to reintroduce and kind of rewire our default to assuming that I am this type, I am this thing, and saying, I've got this global access. Some of us in
a piece of Washington here. The families. Yeah, it's awesome.
That's okay. I got it. Somebody hit accidentally bumped that button. Hold on just a second. Everybody can take a deep breath. We'll find it.
Yeah. No.
Somebody started mowing the yard. It's okay. I'm looking. Where is it at? Hold on. We got it.
Thank you.
There we go. No worries. See, and if you just got triggered by that, then you know the sensory processing for you is different. So you get a chance to take a deep breath and go, there are no bears. right? We have a phrase in the clinic that your brain can't tell the difference between a bear and a deadline. If you're running late for a flight or you're watching the news at the moment and somebody actually pulls a gun on you, your brain doesn't know the difference between perception and reality. So a really helpful thing that I would recommend as you navigate everything in your life moving forward is a distinction. The colloquialism is this a bear or a deadline? Does it feel real? There are no bears. Another way of thinking about it, yeah, thoughts are reality to the brain. Absolutely. It is, your perception is your reality until you remind somebody that there's a difference between something being relevant and something being real. Those are not the same thing. It can be profoundly relevant, but it doesn't mean it's real in the moment. Another phrase that I also use is it's helpful to ask yourself, is my way of life being threatened or is my actual life being threatened? Because if you talk to your colleagues in the DEI space and they're working with communities and BIPOC spaces, their fear of their actual life being threatened is actually statistically and from a perspective standpoint, very verifiable. But when you're looking at your way of life being threatened, the challenge is you're actually going to respond the same way as your actual life being threatened, even though it's your way of life being threatened, until somebody more mature steps into your system and goes, there are no bears. If you run late for the flight, no one will actually die, unless if you miss that flight, which has happened to me and a couple of other friends in different scenarios, if you don't get on the plane, you will miss the chance to say goodbye. Ooh, that hit hard. Because it's still relevant, even if it's 20 years old, right? You may miss the chance to say goodbye to somebody whose life is actually ending, right? That's when you know that the intensity is justified to try and make the flight. But if you're like, I'm not going to get to start my vacation on time, that doesn't mean your actual life is in danger. You see what I'm saying? So just to step back from kind of that diatribe for just a second, that image that I'm showing you with Pangea is to remind you that the beautiful thing with the Enneagram is not that we're broken. It's that we're trying to become more whole, right? It's the idea of saying, look, I'm intrinsically connected to this global experience. It just might feel disparate and it might feel disconnected, especially in the last year and a half, right? Yeah. Danielle, let me pull the picture back up again for a second. I took it away for just a moment. Thank you for letting me know. And I might miss some of the chat because I just caught that. So if I'm missing anything else, feel free to jump in and let me know.
I got you back.
Cool. Thank you, madam. So yeah, so just a couple of words. Also, if you guys go back and you watch the recording, everything that's in this orientation for these lines are correlations with each other, okay? So for those of you who've ever heard anything about Oscar Ichazo's Enneagons, right, and all of these other pieces, can I just be totally honest to a group of other Enneagram nerds for a second? Why are we having such an intense conversation about Oscar Ichazo's 108 Enneagons, but I haven't seen a list of them ever, nowhere? Like they're like this, it's like the Yeti or the Sasquatch. Like everybody knows about them, but no one's seen them, right? I'm like, I want the list. I want to know that what 108 Enneagons did we see, right? Anyways, my point with that is when you look at the head, heart, and gut, that's three separate things that make a complete human being, right? It's like if you study any of the Gurdjieffian process through fourth way, everything that's coming into this content is 1 + 1 + 1 equals a new 1, right? That's the way the brain works. You've got the left brain, the right brain, and the brainstem giving you a whole brain. It's 1 + 1 + 1 equals a complete 1, right? So every single thing that you see on the list, I'll bring it up again in a second. As you read from top to bottom, they're correlations with each other. So when you see the head center being attributed to masculine, the heart center being attributed to feminine, and then the gut center being attributed to reproductive, they're not only metaphorical, they're literal. In brain science, masculine hormone chemistry is produced by the left brain. Feminine hormone chemistry is produced by the right brain. Reproductive systems are in the brainstem. So when you see somebody who's high in the gut center, there's a reason that they're able to more effectively and naturally reproduce either themselves or their process or their mechanism for survival, because they're reproductive in nature. They're very capable of efficiently reproducing the act of who they are. Somebody who's in the heart center tends to move in what we attribute, generally speaking, inappropriately to gender, but more appropriately to role and responsibility. That the right brain is where feminine neurochemistry lives. So I'm very high in the heart center. So my access to emotion and my access to tears and my access to all of the gifts of the spirit or all of the things that are normally attributed to females, not males, is very easy for me. But clearly, if you look at me, I don't look female. I'm 6'2", 285 pounds, and I have a beard, but I lead with my heart. My wife is 5'1", 125 pounds, smoking hot. Even 18 years in our marriage, she looks just the same as she did 15 years ago. She's incredibly feminine, but she leads with her head center. So in our household, she tends to be more of the rule setter, disciplinarian kind of head of the household, but she's clearly female. So it's not a gender attribution, it's a role and responsibility piece. So if you look at all of those, kind of triadic pieces, I have a goal in my life to make 108 triadic connections and then actually list them. So 50 years from now, somebody doesn't go, I heard that Dr. Jerome has these triads that are kind of like the Enneagram, but no one's ever seen them, right? Because it drives me crazy when I'm trying to do something practically and I can't find it, right? So let me show you again one more chance, and I'll take a deep breath. So it shows you, for instance, the left brain is by default more analytical. It doesn't mean that if you're a right brain person, you're not analytical. It doesn't mean if you're a heart center lead, you're not analytical. It just means that we know from neuroanatomy and the way the brain functions, this tends to take the lead on analytical processing compared to creative, compared to practical, right? You've got left brain, right brain, and brainstem, mental health, emotional health, and physical health. So all of these things are just giving you an idea. Again, everybody's like, just leave it up so I can copy it down. It's okay. You're going to get it. You already got it. Believe it. No scarcity models here. Okay. It's just reminding you that all of those things are correlations, but I don't want to be, and one of my favorite phrases from Russ Hudson, who I've probably spent more time with than anybody else. Nobody wants to be a third of a person, right? So all of those pieces are just letting you know how you access all of that. And the way it becomes practical is, if I don't know what my lowest numbers are, or my lowest, what I refer to as efficiencies, if I don't know what my lowest efficiencies are, then I don't know that when you drop me into an 8 space, a 5 space, or a 7 space, I'm going to hemorrhage resources at a much faster rate because I don't have stamina in those places. I am craving affirmation in a 2 space, but it's very hard for me to be celebrated. Like, I actually had to do a breathing exercise as Clare is naming all of the things that I've done, because it feels so self-aggrandizing. It feels so awkward for people to celebrate what you've done. And then I'm also processing, wow, I've gone through a lot to get to the point that people could say that. So I'm both celebrating it and uncomfortable at the same time. And that's because my 2 is saying, thank you, that's amazing. And my 7 is like, this is weird, I don't want to be highlighted, right? So it's knowing those 2 things that help me to be a healthier person at the same time. Does that make sense?
Well, it does, Dr. J. And I love one of the things that you wrote in the Brain-Based Enneagram. You said, reward and trauma are the most identity shaping experiences, and it's happening mostly on an unconscious level. So both trauma and reward, all of that. So I want to kind of take us into 2020 to 2021 pandemic land for a minute.
Yes, ma'am.
You said when something positive or negative happens long enough, strong enough, or often enough, our brain creates a limbic attachment to the experience. And you use 9/11 as an example. Could you use the pandemic as an example and tell us about how your identity is shaped, both what you want to take in and say, yes, yes, and what you're, both the reward and the trauma of life. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I can. And it's a great question, Claire. It's one of the things that, how many people have heard the phrase, it's nature versus nurture? Right? Okay. It's not true. It's nature, nurture, and discipline-based conditioning collectively. Okay. What I mean by that is, and I'll connect this with the answer for you, Claire, is the nature is the way that you came out of the factory. That's the hardware standpoint. That's your genetics. That's everybody ancestrally and through everything that you have from a previous genetic line. That's your nature, right? Nurture is the environment that gave you the context and the experiences that you uniquely had, right? Like my twin brother and I, same exact nature. Okay. We started out as the same embryo. We became 2 people. We grew up in the exact same environment in terms of what was nurtured in our container. But the discipline-based conditioning and also our experience and encounter or our expression as a result of that very, very different. Okay. How do you get identical twins where one of them becomes a 7 with an 8 wing and in his maturity has really leaned into his 6 wing? That's my twin brother. And me leaning more into a 2 with a 3 wing, but also allowing that 1 to come in, because it's not either or, it's both and then some. It's because my encounter with my dad's experience around discipline was very different than my twin brothers. My strategy for survival when I encountered what I needed to do to be self-disciplined, very different than my brothers. So we're not only talking about our relationship with how we receive discipline, but we're talking about the relationship of how when we were given the opportunity to drive or given the keys or the lack thereof, what did we do when we were able to decide how we became disciplined, right? And when you think discipline-based conditioning, I want you to think about what you reproduce and what you practice. When you're in a nurturing environment or a lack thereof, that's not practice, that's encounter, okay? That's different. And we've heard the phrase, practice makes perfect. It's actually not true neurologically. There's a theory called Hebbian theory where neurons fire together, they wire together. Okay. And I love that Colette's nodding her head. I feel like Colette's got some of this in her. She knows it. I feel it. I feel some camaraderie there. Thank you, man. When you have the opportunity to practice something, it's actually that practice makes permanent. And the question becomes, what are you practicing? Right. And the reality is, even when you guys think about that, depending on your lived experiences, like we're talking about now to tie it in with your question, Claire, there's a degree of hesitancy and fear about what the permanency may be. If you're a Black person, what is the permanency of police brutality and racial equity? If you're an LGBTQ person, what is the permanency of your felt and seen image, especially if you're trying to reconcile that in the nature of who you are as far as God is defined, right? We're talking about these big topics. What's the permanency of COVID? What's the permanency of the world being on fire? What's the permanency of all of these things that we're watching happen right now when it feels like the world's turning itself into a pineapple upside down cake that's been thrown into a volcano, right? The whole thing looks very confusing. But I want you to remember, permanency is not indefinite. That's not the same thing, okay? If you have concrete that you're driving on the highway, is that a permanent fixed structure? Yeah, absolutely. Do you know what happens when somebody comes into a city, which I know that Danielle can appreciate in Houston, I did in Dallas? They got way too many highways and they're always building them, okay? There's just way too much that's happening with highways, right? But if you have something that is a concrete highway and it is a permanent structure, can you build a new highway and can you deconstruct that highway and build a highway in a different place, right? Okay, practice makes permanent. There you go. So why I say that is permanent doesn't mean indefinite. Permanent means fixed at that moment. And if you practice something new, the power of habit, right? All of these great books that show us how to change the way that our brain works, Whole Brain Child, right? Everything by Dan Siegel in terms of mindsight, everything by, all of these incredible people that are doing polyvagal therapy. The truth is we can change the way the brain is wired. We can also, based on how much we reinforce it, change the way that the brain structurally is made, even into your 60s, 70s, and 80s. The myth about your brain being fixed is completely wrong. So when I say practice makes permanent, I mean, it's just permanent at the moment. And when we're talking about how we encounter our lives and how we became the identity that we have now, the current fixed state of things, and the dynamism that created it in real time, we're looking at that and going, okay, well, how do I become a healthy person moving forward? Asking yourself the question, how often am I doing things or not? How strong is that experience when I do it or not? And how long does that experience last for or not? Those three things together will give you a severity scale, will give you the energy required, right? So another kind of 4E, 5E word that I'll use is you have an encounter that produces an experience that then leads to an expression. So encounter, experience, expression. Those three things together give you the opportunity to understand what the energy of the endeavor is, right? The energy of the endeavor. So for instance, and I'll catch that question in just a second. If I am very low in 8 energy, for instance, I'm not an assertive person. I'm an energetic person. I'm a social person. I'm not an assertive person, because my experience with assertive people is that I mistranslate that based on a lot of really relevant experiences, that means aggressive. So I have to reframe assertive with aggressive with assertive. And assertive just means that you're advancing, that you're moving forward. You're asserting your foot on the gas pedal so you can achieve momentum, right? So if I want to learn how to engage in an 8 space for myself, and I know that that's an assertive stance that also has to deal with disruption, I get to ask myself, when I feel really uncomfortable things, especially relationally as a heart-based person, how long do I stay in those conversations? How often do I give myself the opportunity to encounter them? And how intense is that conversation when it happens? So when I say you're looking at the world right now, take all of the containers that we're looking at and all of the things that we're looking at and ask yourself, if this was a physical workout, if I was physically exercising, am I taking into consideration if this is safe for me? If this is supportive for me, if this is something that I should or should not be engaging in by myself or with a support group? Because if you step into an exercise space and you're going to encounter stress, you're going to need to break a sweat and you're going to need to stretch yourself in order to physically develop stamina and muscle mass in that space. But if I exceed my threshold and I go too strong, I go for too long, and I do it too often, I will injure myself. And this is to distill it again, just for a couple of bullet points, because we can't boil the ocean in an hour, and I'm trying to give you as much as I can. Is that a couple of ways that I phrase it is what I hear when you ask your question. It's a window of tolerance, 100%. Anything that you read by Dan Siegel for interpersonal neurobiology will help you understand this. It's brilliant for bigger conversations. And really anything by Andrew Newberg, who's the father of neurotheology, is very good. Andrew Newberg. What we're talking about in this is how you develop resilience, right? So when we look at the last year and a half, if you ask somebody and they honestly answer, how hard has the last year and a half been for you? If somebody says it wasn't, there's one of two options. They're either in denial and lying, and they haven't reconciled what the last year and a half has been, or simply put, it wasn't their hardest year, right? They've been through harder things. So this year a year and a half has been profoundly difficult for a lot of people. For me, the last year and a half was definitively not my hardest year, right? I've had a lot harder years. It's been hard as a patient, but you're talking to somebody who survived 2 suicide attempts. My last one was 8 years ago. I have not felt like doing that this last year and a half. I have to be conscientious of when those thoughts are pervasive and they come in, but moving into a place where I decided that was a viable avenue to take, I haven't been there in a year and a half. I have in the past. So for some people, it's been profoundly difficult, but my experience of building resilience, whether I wanted to or not, because I promise you a lot of the times I did not want to do that workout, is tied to this phrase that I'll give you to land the plane, and then ask if you can, Danielle, because I haven't been able to keep up with the chats. Just let me know where you need me to go next. Is post-traumatic growth is great. This is a phrase that I want to give you, and it's got a couple of lines that follow it, okay? Resilience, by definition, is knowing the difference as quickly as possible between discomfort and trauma. If you can tell the difference very quickly, you are resilient. Because if you don't know that your way of life is in danger and you assume it's your actual life is in danger, you may storm the Capitol. I'm not saying that that's true. I'm saying that it might have happened, okay? But sorry if I threw anybody off there, I just gotta say it. If you end up in a space where you think it's an actual real-time life-threatening experience, you're going to have to respond as if it's trauma. But what if it's just actually that you're profoundly uncomfortable, right? There's a difference. Well, then how do you know the difference between discomfort and trauma? The easy answer, again, if we come back to this idea of how does my physical body encounter these things? And all of the things that we're looking at, from instinct to type to intelligence center to tri-type to Hornevian to harmonic to every integration of the Enneagram, doesn't matter. The way that you understand, is this something that is going to make me uncomfortable, or is this something that is going to traumatize me? Am I reflecting on something that was uncomfortable, or am I becoming present and aware of something that was traumatic? It's based on the length of time for recovery, okay? It's the length of time for recovery. If you do something that hurts for 2 to 3 days, it was not a trauma, full stop. So if you've ever been in a conversation, I've been with my wife 18 years, married 16 years, and sometimes you have those conversations if you've been in a relationship with somebody for more than a week, that things go a little sideways. And you say something and you're like, this is really intense. But then you know what? 3 days later, you can't remember what made you frustrated. You know why? It wasn't that big of a deal. Because if it was, your brain's not qualifying whether or not you think you should catalog it. If it felt like a life-threatening event, you know what it's going to do? it's going to remember it. So if it only hurts for 2 to 3 days, that was discomfort. If it hurts for a week or less, it's discomfort. If it hurts between a week and 30 days, so let's make it really easy, a week or less, that's uncomfortable. Between 2 and 4 weeks, that's an injury, right? And injuries have different degrees, okay? Injuries mean they overdid it. You went a little too hard, a little too long, and a little too frequently. So you got to adjust your engagement. You got to adjust your pace. Maybe you're watching a little too much news and you can't metabolize everything that's coming in. So you got to step out of that experience and catch your breath. Everybody who works out takes a break. They take a water break. Because if you work out as hard as everybody's watching social media and they're on their screens, you will pass out in the middle of the gym and you will stay there. Okay. So we got to figure out if it's between 2 to 4 weeks that it takes time for us to recover from it, that's an injury. But if it takes more than 4 weeks for you to work through it, to reconcile it, to metabolize it, to digest it, then it is a trauma. And the degree to which it takes for you to recover, or the length of time that it takes for you to recover, is the degree of the trauma. So my dad passed away when I was 14. And I can tell you, I'll see if I can get through this without getting emotional because my brain's already thinking about it. I can tell you the exact sound of I can tell you exactly what it sounds like to hear a sternum break. Okay. Because when we came back home and my dad had passed away watching Creflo Dollar on his favorite chair when he was 43, and he didn't wake back up. And my bipolar grandmother thought that he was just getting cold. And we came home to 7 blankets on top of him. And my mom's looking at it going, I don't understand why there's 7 blankets. And she was a field nurse in the Rhodesian Bush War. So she very, very quickly realized something wasn't right. We just come up the stairs and my mom, who's 5'1", and my dad, who's my size, my mom literally grabs my dad by the ankles, pulls him off of a recliner, and very first hit, she breaks his sternum because she knows how to do CPR, right? But he's already gone, right? That, even as I process through it now, I'm like, that's not actually happening. Is it relevant? It's profoundly relevant. It changed my life, right? Is it real right now? No, I can take a deep breath. Okay, my body's just trying to process. Do you need me to run the same protocol that we ran? Because I don't know that 24 years has passed. I think it just happened, right? So no, it didn't just happen. It's super relevant. But even after 24 years, it's still a part of my system that is working through what it looks like to recover from that. Because that trauma is going to affect my life for the rest of my life. It's whether or not I realize that I can resolve it and check in and tell my body it's not a bear that's actively in the room at the moment. It was profoundly painful and traumatic at the time, but this is post-traumatic growth, like Colette texted. This is a case of going super relevant, not real in real time. And that gives us a chance to kind of connect that. So resilience, difference between discomfort and trauma, understanding that difference is the length of time for recovery. So if it's a month or less, check in with how you can adjust. If it's a month or more, make sure that you're connecting with supportive people who can help you work through trauma-informed processes. Because if it's taking you more than a month to recover, it's probably going to take support as well. So.
Yeah, I love that. And I just like to add the word trauma trained, not just trauma informed, because there are a lot of people who have some information, right? And I know
it's like everybody's well-researched at the moment because they know how to use Google. Okay.
Yes,
Google,
I've done my research.
Google did not go to med school. Okay. And Google does not have an epidemiology degree. So just take it with a grain of salt. Okay. I highly encourage everybody to lead in all things in the future with the following sentence: based on my current understanding, which means that you can adjust that understanding. Okay. So thank you for that, Claire. That's really relevant. Somebody else wanting to be added to the room.
Yeah. So I think we can only take maybe 1 or 2 quick questions just because we're going to have you over time. Are you okay for another 2-3 more minutes?
Yeah, I'm okay. Would you do me a favor, Dr. Scheller? Will you just, and forgive me, the 2 in me feels inappropriate about this, but one of my clinical associates was sitting off camera and I didn't tell you guys about that. So I apologize for not having that full transparency. We started and I forgot to introduce him. So that's Dr. Schuyler. He's going to check the patient that comes in at 1 o'clock because we're slotting you guys between appointments here. Yes. I think we'll give me some grace for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. If you'll ask her if we can just maybe start at 12:15.
Oh, that's really generous.
Awesome.
And no we worries. Can only have 3 to 5.
No, you're okay.
Okay.
I have a gap after her appointment, so that's where I know I've got a little bit of flex. Because
No.
as much as I love y'all, I'm not compromising patient care. Doesn't matter,
No,
right? But
no,
I do
thank
have a
you.
little bit of space after her.
Danielle, is there someone that you'd like to call on?
Well, I would love to make sure that Bethany's very great question was responded to in Dr. Jerome's response. I feel like he went a little into it, Bethany. I just want to make sure, though, that you feel complete, or at least like you've gotten a start on the response to your question around rewiring neural pathways and building resilience after your polyvagal response being hijacked. I think that it was a good start, but I want to make sure you're complete.
And I'll give Bethany a chance. Bethany, I'm reading your comment at the moment. So if you have anything you want to add, feel free to share that as I read the comment quickly, because I didn't see it until now.
Yeah. Yes, it was a great start. I'm thinking specifically of people who have been through trauma therapy.
I feel like we're losing Bethany a bit, and I'm sorry about that. Bethany, can you, when you answer the question, would you do me a favor? I don't know if your video is on or not, but will you turn your video off and then answer the question with just the audio? It might give us a little bit more of a stream. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Bethany's video was off, so I think she's
off. Okay.
got a really
This may be a
bad
connection.
spot.
So
yeah.
I hear the context of the question. If Bethany comes back in, feel free to interrupt me. I won't be offended in the slightest bit. It's actually interesting though, in this as an example, right? So when Bethany asked the question, if you have an intense somatic response, how does that person rewire their neural pathways and build the resilience to stop that? A classic example is what just happened, right? So I have several patients that I'm working with that if they have an interruption in an audio feedback while they're in the middle of listening to headphones, it'll immediately trigger what's called a Mesolimbic Escape. So basically they Hulk out. Basically they have a panic attack. So they've had a normal level of volume and then there's a glitch and their system automatically goes into a startle response. So Bethany's asked her really profound question, and then in the middle of asking her question in a vulnerable and transparent way, her audio drops out and her ability to be seen is changed. So how does her body respond to that? She may not have had a trigger. I can tell you on my end, as somebody who's a high empath and somebody who's very high in two, my desire for her to be heard is creating a somatic experience in me, right? That I want her to be able to ask her question and I want to be able to hear her voice. So one of the things that can be really helpful in that is every single opportunity that you have in a non-life-threatening way to practice saying that is not trauma or that is not significant. It's relevant, but it's not real. So case in point in practical space, I felt triggered by the fact that her audio cut out. Does that mean that I am unsafe? No. Did that mean that I'm uncomfortable? Yes. Right. The beautiful thing with trauma training and trauma informed care and really good therapy is you want to be able to notice and name. So I noticed that hit me. I don't know why just yet. I'm naming that it's uncomfortable, but I'm not sure what to do with it yet. I'm also legitimately from an executive level, leadership, adult, authority, parental based position of care saying I'm safe, even if I don't feel comfortable. So when you're talking about these pathways of rewiring, a really simple kind of container is to say that the system works through bottom up. I'm going to re-add Bethany here. She's coming back in. And I'll give you that piece. Welcome back, Bethany. Can you hear me? Feel free to unmute if you're muted, Bethany. I can't hear you just yet. That's okay. Interrupt me if you're able to get your audio working, Bethany. Okay, we'll jump back in. But the container that I use is that it's bottom-up development and top-down control. Okay, there's not a single person that I work with across the board that has somatic responses like Bethany is talking about that doesn't have sensory processing factors. Okay, they don't have sensory processing in terms of either there's hypersensitivity to sound, or there's hypersensitivity to light, or significant hypersensitivity to touch. Right? There's not a single patient that I work with, or a single human being that I work with, that has anxiety that isn't also ticklish. Okay, the exact same system that develops ticklishness develops anticipation to touch, develops anticipation, develops concern, worry, and then anxiety. It's you actually build the capacity to even understand what you're concerned about first through your somatic experience to touch. So when somebody's working on rewiring these things, a great way to do it is to find safe ways for you to experience touch. Now, if I'm not trauma trained and I don't understand that I need to clarify for somebody, that doesn't have to include another human being, because for you to have another human being touch you is going to be significantly difficult. I've got a patient right now that we've been working together for 3 years, and I just yesterday had the first opportunity to actually do physical contact with her, because it's taken 3 years for her to get to a point with a safe body to do that. So when I mean, what is your relationship with physical touch? I'm saying, can you walk around barefoot? Can you hold a cup of coffee and check in with how warm one hand is versus the other? To hold the coffee and check in, okay, what does it feel like on my index, middle, ring, pinky compared to thumb? Let it go, check with the other hand, and then feel what it looks like for that intensity of the heat to change as I'm no longer holding it. To be in the shower and to change the temperature of the water. So you go, can I tell the difference between warm versus hot, warm versus cool, cool versus cold? So one of the ways that you can really do this, especially if you're talking about somatic experiencing, is can I engage in a healthy conversation and a safe conversation at the rate? So again, intensity, frequency, and duration. How strong, how often, how long? If that comes to the conversation of touch, you can do it by yourself by being barefoot, by being aware of texture, and being aware of temperature. So just checking in with my polo feels different than my beard, right? Feels different than my forehead. So temperature and texture, you can do it by yourself, and you can also do it with another person. A great book is by Deb Dana called 50 Exercises for Polyvagal for Connection. And I've forgotten the last one, but Deb Dana is a great book as well. So I hope that answers the question. What was the next one that you had, Danielle? I've still got a few minutes. I can hear Dr. Schuyler chatting with my patient, and she's okay.
Okay, so looking in the chat, we had another great question from Colette. And Colette, could you just clarify, because it seems like this was a fragment that was from a longer question. You said when the body or nervous system is triggered. So I'm wondering, is there more to your question? I want to make sure that we're complete with that.
Oh, thank you. No, I was just asking to clarify Bethany's statement above. Like, and Dr. Jerome was speaking on that. So I was just, the whole fragment. Yeah. So I was like, am I connecting the dots? It wasn't so much as a question, but he answered it in his statement.
Great.
Awesome.
Awesome. Thanks, Colette. So that feels resolved for you?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Awesome.
And Kathy McCready earlier talked about, this is probably a larger conversation, but do you have any insights on how an ADHD diagnosis affects our approach to Enneagram type?
Yeah.
And I know that's a whole nother midday.
Oh, I tell you what, we might have a couple courses on that one. The reality is that ADHD, first and foremost, it's also conceptually, this is a great opportunity to remind ourselves that based on our current understanding, okay? So as things get updated, we have to have the humility and the lack of hubris to recognize that maybe what we understood before isn't wholly true. At one point, x-rays were the best we had and photos were the best we had. And then somebody's like, moving pictures. That's why they're called movies, okay? Because it's a picture that's moving. So in the world that we live in, things evolve. We got MRI and then we got functional MRI. Well, one of the things that happened, and I say that to say the Enneagram has to evolve with our understanding of how we operate as human beings as well. But the understanding of ADHD was that it was actually really inappropriately named. It's not attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's actually that you've got an excess capacity to attend to everything, right? It's not that you've got a deficit in attention. It's that you've got an overwhelming excess of attentiveness. It's that you can't attend to one singular thing at a time. but you're attending to everything. So just to say that first, it's the nature, the polyvagal theory by Deb Dana. Thank you. When we're looking at ADHD, I can tell you for the sake of time, ADHD is very, very much tied to the head center. ADHD is going to show up much more in 7 energy than anywhere else. The difference that you see in ADHD compared to OCD, the O in OCD is the 5, the C in OCD is the 1. Because obsessing over something, a perseveration of thought, is 5 energy if you see it pathologically. And I don't even like using the word pathological. I'm going to shift it to excess, a lack of restraint or regulation. If you can't slow it down and you're no longer in the driver's seat, it's just quantity, right? And the reason I say that to normalize some things from a diagnosis standpoint, every human being on the planet is on the autism spectrum. Okay. It just depends on when you fall. Every human being on the planet has ADHD. We just normally grow out of it, or we have enough discipline-based conditioning to change our orientation to it. Every human being on the planet is bipolar. We just normally grow out of it. Okay. I have an 11-month-old, a 3.5-year-old, and a 5-year-old. And my 3.5-year-old right now is in her bipolar phase. She can lose a sock or lose a shoe and completely unravel. She has literally just lost a limb or a close family member. And then 3 minutes later, she is the happiest person on the planet. She went from depressive to manic. She is quintessentially bipolar. But her system at 3.5 is figuring out how to regulate the neurochemistry that's being introduced into her system for the first time. She's not unhealthy, she's unpracticed, right? So when we're talking about all of our places in the Enneagram, it's not that we're unhealthy. Oftentimes it's that we're unpracticed. So when we're talking about ADHD from an Enneagrammatic standpoint, most of the time that's a practice in 7 and a lack of practice in 5 and a sensor awareness around heart. So more than 60% of my practice is pediatric nonverbal autism or pediatric head injury. And very few times do I get a high heart center when I'm working with somebody who's ADHD. They're a high 7 energy, oftentimes very 7-8 wing. They're dealing with tons of sensory experiences. And that's why I changed the 7 with an 8 wing from the name of a realist to a sensationalist. They're dealing with insane sensory experiences. They're addicted to adrenaline, not allergic to it. Like a 4 with a 5 might be. They're allergic to adrenaline. So I think just a couple of pieces there. ADHD is part of it, but none of this has been documented. This is just my correlation. But one other thing, just to give you conceptually that might help. If you take the stances of assertive, withdrawal, and duty, and you change them to gas, brake, and cruise. Okay, assertive stances are a gas pedal. Duty stances are a cruise control. They're trying to maintain a sense of equilibrium or status quo. They're trying to conserve things, not utilize them or preserve them. But a withdrawal stance is a brake pedal, right? It's trying to withhold. It's trying to preserve resources, not conserve resources. Slight subtle difference. If you understand that and you apply that same gas, cruise, and brake, the gut center is a brake, the heart center is a gas pedal, and the head center is a cruise control. It's the same thing. And then the stances of assertive, withdrawal, and then duty. Assertive is a gas pedal, withdrawal is a brake pedal, and then duty is a cruise control. Last piece, instincts. Sexual is a gas pedal, self-preservation is a brake pedal, social is a cruise control. If you take that same concept and you connect it to pacing and you connect it to relative energy expenditure, then you can start to understand, why is a sexual 9 so much different? Well, it's because their instinct is to hit the gas, but in order to accomplish their ability to hit peace, right? So they'll show up in order for things to calm down really quick. That's very different than a self-preservation 9. They're not engaging in order to be safe. They're withdrawing in order to be safe. So different energy. So gas, cruise, and brake from a neuro standpoint can sometimes help with an orientation. And I appreciate everybody letting me just throttle you with all of that really quickly. And Claire, you're muted, friend.
Well, you gave a great gift at the end, because you just named my sweetie, the sexual 9, and the brake and the gas action of his life. So
oh my God. And the amount of compassion for a sexual 9 to be like, I don't really want to show up, but I have to, so please let me recover, right? I need a chance to recover. It's like you're having your own throttled, like whiplash experience. It gives us so much more grace for us to know, well, this isn't about type. It's about the entire global experience of what I'm fluent in. It's a fluency conversation. The next book that I'm writing is all around the language, the idea of language and fluency, and what we speak and why it's so hard sometimes to understand it.
Well, my goodness, you have given us a feast for the head, heart, and gut. We have all of your connections in the chat there, Dr. Jerome. What a gift you are to us.
Thank you.
To this group, anywhere that touches a link. We send you off and know that you'll be doing good work for others. And it is my sincere hope that you will continue to take care of yourself so that your brilliant intellect and your empathic heart and your, oh my goodness, instincts that have just brought us right here and now would just continue in the world for as long as possible. So everyone want to say, in whatever way you want to do that, give a blessing, give a namaste, give a shout out, raise the roof. Let's just say.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, everybody, for the time and the attentiveness in the space. It's so good to see all of you, and we'll continue to connect in the future. I look forward to a chance to do this with you again. So
thank you.
Great to see you. Take care.
So much. And just as a reminder, as we're all logging off, if you want to become a part of